Have any of you ever experienced something unusual crawling into bed with you? Well, this has occurred at least 3 times when I was growing up. I went to boarding school for my high school years, and of course, there were ghost stories about every building and dorm. Some were completely ridiculous, and others very low maybe. Anyway, our beds in the boarding school are single beds. One night I rolled over on my side, and I sighed because now I was awake. And then I heard like a mimicked sigh behind me, and before I could roll over and see who it was, I felt a weight on the bed and this thing snuggled up with me. It was cold. I could feel it was a person because it had laid against me, and for some weird reason it felt like it was having a seizure. Well, I jumped out of bed, but there was nothing there. And the thing is, in your room in my boarding school, there's only one entry or exit. When I jumped out of bed, he would have had to have run past me to get out. So, I then slept in the common room that night. On another occasion, back home, my parents bought me a bunk bed, where the bottom bunk was a queen size and the top bunk was a single but a good-sized one. I slept on the bottom bunk. There was a time I kept waking up in the night because I kept having nightmares, so I started leaving my bedside lamp on. One night though, I almost pissed my pants because in my room, I had a glass sliding door that opened to the front veranda. There were blackout curtains on it, but a few inches where they were off the ground. That night, I thought I saw dirty human feet showing from beneath the curtains. Sometime later on another night, I woke up just catching a glimpse of feet climbing up the steps of the bunk, then a thump of weight on the top bunk, heavy breathing, and then the whole bunk moved like someone was rolling around on top. I was the only other person who lived in the house, besides my parents at the time. When I graduated and left home, I had a trusty pull-out couch I had in my room of a share house. One night after drinking, I laid face down on the couch or bed thing. I wasn't tired, but I was just laying there, swinging my feet off of the edge, when I felt someone sat beside me on the pull-out. I actually thought it was someone I knew, even though I didn't hear the door open. So I sat up and there was nothing there but an imprint in the bed of where a person should be. I was too drunk to be scared, so I put my hand in the spot, and it was ridiculously warm. Like I said, I was pretty drunk, so I later fell asleep. I want to mention one more thing. One of my housemates had a dog called Sweetie, and ironically, it was the ugliest dog that I've ever seen. But it was really friendly and it would walk into our rooms for a visit every now and then. One day, I was laying on the pull-out with the door open, so the dog walked in, and I said hello to it. The dog looked at me, then looked over to the area where there was once that imprint, and then went crazy and started barking and growling at the spot, even jumping between me and the spot on the pull-out with its hair up. And then it jumped off of the bed and out of the door, leaving a puddle of piss on the floor. I'm not terribly good with telling stories about things that happened in my day-to-day life. I tend to keep them to myself. This particular story has really affected how I live my life currently, however, as I was too scared to bring it up when I was much younger. I live in a medium-sized southern town of about 45,000 people. I know all of my neighbors, and the people who go to the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses 3 houses down. I happen to live on the last street within city limits, and it's a pretty elderly and quiet area. The layout of the street is unique as well, making a T-shape towards the end of the main road. The left side of the T road has the Jehovah's Witnesses church, and the right side leads to a road leading to town. At the end of this road is a small gravel driveway that leads to underbrush and a couple of abandoned houses. My youngest sister, 7, and I, 12, decided to take a walk one afternoon through the neighborhood. As we make our way to the stop sign at the end of the T-shaped road, an older woman well into her 60s, and possibly early 70s, rolls out of the dirt driveway in front of us. I had an odd feeling about this woman. I mean, she certainly didn't live in the neighborhood. My brotherly instincts kick in and I force my younger sister, despite her protest, to turn around and start marching back home with me, following close behind. The old woman slowly rides behind before finally driving parallel next to us. She rolls down her window and asks directions to some local store or whatnot. I can't really remember where, and I tell her the basic directions. She then proceeds to insist on my sister and I hopping into a truck so she can take us home. I politely tell her no, that we're on a walk, but she doesn't take no for an answer and proceeds to tell us that she's a friend of my grandmother's, to which my sister abruptly blurts out, "You know Mormor Phyllis?" She says, "Of course I know her. Yeah, Phyllis. We're good friends. Get in the truck." I politely decline again and insist that we really would like to continue our walk. I force my sister to walk lock and step at a pace that I know she can barely handle. The old woman begins to yell out her window at us to get in the damn truck, adding threats that if we don't, she'll be sure to tell our grandmother how we disobeyed an adult and that we were awful children. As we finally get to the driveway, both my sister and I run as quickly as we can down it and to the front porch, bursting back into the house. My grandmother asks how our walk was. We lie and say that we had a race. That was about it. We never talked about it again. I've never seen that woman or that truck in my neighborhood since that incident, and believe for a fact that my sister and I, we wouldn't be living if we had jumped into a truck. This takes place late last spring, almost exactly 1 year ago. At the time, my parents and I lived a somewhat solitary life out in the countryside. Other than bad cell phone and internet reception, there were other homes in the area, but not many, and they exclusively consisted of retirees and wealthy families. My parents, who are wealthy and retired, were planning a trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to sightsee and visit my mum's ill mother. I've been to Gettysburg before on a class field trip, and decided not to go. I had schoolwork and projects to work on that were due that Friday, and going to Gettysburg for a second time didn't seem all that interesting to me. My parents do a lot of traveling and volunteer work, and, over the years, they placed a lot of trust in me, so they had no issues with me being alone for several days, or even a week at a time by the time I reached 16 years old and obtained my driver's license. So, anyway, I got up the morning of their departure, and by the time I left for school, my parents were preparing to leave. When I got home that afternoon, they were already gone, and I now had 3 days alone. I spent the first afternoon and evening doing homework and gaming. That evening, I decided to drive out to the closest town and pick up a pizza for myself since I didn't feel like preparing anything. When I got home, I ate about half a pizza and, after watching some YouTube, decided to turn in for the night. I awoke sometime around midnight, which isn't out of the ordinary for me as I sometimes have trouble sleeping at night. I went downstairs for a glass of orange juice and decided to flip through the channels on our living room television. I was sitting there, looking at my phone more than watching the television, when I saw a light turn on through one of the living room windows. It was our garage's motion sensor light. Did my parents come home much earlier than expected? I sat quietly and waited. The light eventually turned off and I didn't hear any noises. It must have been an animal or something, maybe a deer. I turned off the television and went upstairs and into my bedroom and lied in bed. I fell asleep not too long afterwards. I awoke to the sound of my alarm. Time to get ready for school. Oh joy. I arose, got ready and headed out of the door into my car and drove off to school. I got home that afternoon and spent the day similarly to before. I did my homework, gamed, ate dinner and went to bed. I slept the night that night and awoke the next day and headed off to school. My mum called me during school and left a message saying that her and my dad are going to stay longer than expected as my grandmother was in some pretty rough shape. I got home and once again the day went as it did the last two, except this time I finished up my senior project and was almost officially finished with high school. About damn time, I say. I relaxed that evening outside on our hammock and read a book until sunset, debating whether or not to travel to Gettysburg the next day to visit my grandmother. Dinner time came and went, and I decided to settle on the couch and continue reading my book. Since it was Friday, I had no school the next day, and stayed up longer than usual. It was about 11 o'clock at night when I looked at my phone and noted the time. I decided to go upstairs and game for a couple of hours, though. I left my bedroom and crossed the foyer to use the bathroom sometime that night, when I noticed that through one of our front door windows that the garage light was on again. That's really odd. I peered outside towards the light and saw my car, but nothing else. The light turned off and I went to use the bathroom. I decided to grab a snack afterwards, so went into the kitchen after using the bathroom and made a sandwich. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from one of our morning room windows. I felt on edge as I looked towards the tapping and saw nothing but blinds over the windows. Having never dealt with something like this before, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't have been hearing things, could I? I definitely didn't imagine the motion sensor light being on. I wanted to call my mum, but they were most likely sleeping by now. I waited and listened in to see if I could hear anything else. Nothing. I went upstairs into my parents' bedroom and found my dad's handgun in his dresser drawer. I sat in my bedroom and looked out of my window towards the backyard. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes or so, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. I eventually went back downstairs, and to my horror, I heard the tapping noise again, except now it was coming from one of the front door windows. The garage sensor light was on, but when I looked towards the window, I didn't see anybody. Perhaps a friend of mine was playing a prank on me or something. I have a couple of good friends who know that I'm home alone, but they've never done anything like this before, though. I texted all of them and got only one reply. Remember that friend that I mentioned at the beginning of this story? It was that friend. He denied being at my house and told me that he was lying in bed, trying to sleep. I waited and waited until I could hear another noise, but about half an hour went by without further incident. I didn't see the garage light come on again, nor did I hear any other noises for the rest of the night. And so, I turned in for the night after checking the locks on our doors and windows. I awoke the next morning and went downstairs to have breakfast. Afterwards, I vividly remembered the previous night's events and went outside to look around the house to see if anything was out of place or peculiar. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, though. Our patio was left untouched, none of our stuff had been moved or taken, and our shed, it hadn't been tampered with. I looked inside of it and didn't notice anything missing that I had seen the week prior while assisting my dad with the yard work. I went back inside and decided to sleep for a while longer. I awoke that afternoon around 2:30. I called my mum and told her about what happened last night, and she told me to keep my dad's gun with me if necessary, and to call the police if I saw anyone or heard the tapping again. She also told me that they would be home the next evening. I went on a drive later on that afternoon and stopped by my friend's house for a while before heading home. I came home later than expected and went inside, plopping myself down on the couch and watched some YouTube on my phone until nightfall. After eating dinner, I sat back on the couch and watched some more YouTube. I was dozing off on the couch when I heard the sound of someone walking on our patio. I swiftly made my way towards the back door and waited, listening for any more noises. I then had an idea. I quietly ran towards the front door and peered towards the garage to see if this person would walk towards it and turn the motion sensor light on. Then I could see if I knew the person, or at least I could see their face. And luckily, exactly that happened. I was looking towards the garage when the light came on. I saw the person light up in the night, and it wasn't anybody that I recognized. At first, I couldn't tell if it was a male or a female, given their long hair that covered half of their face, and their attire wasn't noticeably masculine or feminine in appearance. What I could tell, though, was that this person was armed and was carrying a dagger. I had to call the police, now. I may have a gun, but I'm way too afraid to confront this creepy-looking person on my own, especially since I was probably not going to have the guts to actually shoot him or her if they attacked me or tried to get inside. Suddenly, though, we made eye contact. I felt my heart drop. I saw a smirk form across the person's face as they walked towards the front door towards me. I jumped up and ran towards the kitchen and called 911. After being redirected to the state police barracks, I told the dispatcher that an armed man or woman with some sort of dagger was creeping around my house. I stayed on the phone with him as I heard the person tapping on the front door, presumably with their weapon. I couldn't tell you what I felt at this point. Unfortunately, the closest officer was about half an hour away from me, so I had to fend for myself until then. I tried my best to describe the person to the dispatcher, but I simply couldn't. I told her about the motion light coming on the first night, the tapping noises, and the sound of someone walking on my patio. She then asked if he or she had tried to force entry, but I said no, which was equally as baffling between the two of us. I jumped when I suddenly heard the tapping coming from behind me. I heard a deep, muffled laugh coming from outside. Well, at least now I knew it was a man. I looked at my phone after not hearing the dispatcher for a few moments, only to notice that the call had dropped. Why now? This damn reception out here in the middle of nowhere. I felt genuinely afraid at this point, so I ran up to the upper part of my foyer and laid down on the carpet and focused my attention on both halves of my house, the front door and the back door, gun in my hand, phone in the other. I didn't have to recall the barracks, given the dispatcher had already called me back by the time I settled down on the ground in the foyer. My phone signal was weak, so I wasn't sure how much longer I would be able to stay on the line. As I waited, I heard the occasional tapping noise on my windows and doors. I then heard for the first time the sound of my back door being tapped. I talked to the dispatcher, who was doing her best job to keep me calm as I sat there like a scared little mouse hiding from a cat. I was so scared, even with a gun in my hand. After about 15 minutes and losing connection with the dispatcher again, the occasional sounds ceased. I went into the master bedroom and looked out the window towards the road. I stared at it for quite some time when I finally saw a car driving up towards my house. Finally, the police are here. I ran downstairs and waited near the front door and watched as a squad car came into my driveway. As I watched, two cops came out, one coming up to the door as the other walked around the house. I opened the door and greeted the female officer, who came inside. We stood there in the foyer as I explained the previous night's events leading up to tonight, and then finally tonight. I also gave my description of the person. She made notes about everything while the male officer was walking around my house. After a few more questions, she told me that they'll drive around the area a couple of times and recommend that my parents install a security system when they return from their trip. I felt nervous after they left, especially because the male officer was unable to find a trace of the person who was screwing with me. Hopefully this potential burglar, or whatever they were, is now aware that this isn't a house to be messed with. When my parents returned the next day, I filled them in on what had occurred during their trip. It wasn't until about a month later when my parents finally had a wireless security system installed in our home. Luckily, nothing major happened during that month, even during the times when I was home alone. However, the story doesn't end here. Unfortunately, there was another smaller incident that occurred. This time, when I wasn't home, but both of my parents were. I was away from home for a couple of days on a fishing and camping trip with two friends from school when my mum had called me, telling me that they had suspected that somebody had been trespassing on our property late the previous evening. My dad had gone outside to investigate after noticing our garage light come on several times over the span of about an hour as he sat in the living room watching television. Of course, he found nobody, but did notice that one of our patio chairs had been moved ever so slightly. I came home and never truly felt comfortable at night, even in my locked, secured house. Sometimes at night, my mind plays tricks on me and I imagine hearing the same tapping noise that I heard previously. Of course, I don't believe anyone is there, but I can't shake the feeling. Even a year later, I still sometimes feel like someone is outside my house when I'm awake at night.